So welcome, Mike J, to the Australian Psychedelic Society's inaugural Cactus Day.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And May the 23rd seemed very fitting to have a day for all things cactus, as LSD and mushrooms have their day. So Mike J is the author of the recently released book Mescaline, A Global History of the First Psychedelic, and the author of many other books and articles about drugs and their history, including High Society, which I highly recommend, and which was accompanied by an exhibition he curated at Wellcome Collection in London in 2010. Mike has worked with the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew on intoxication in 2014, a season about psychoactive plants, which included putting their huge peyote plant on public display, and was an expert witness for the defence in several trials for San Pedro importation and possession, in which all defendants were acquitted every time. Fantastic work. So to accompany the book Mescaline, Mike also curated an exhibition of surrealist art produced on mescaline in the 1930s. So it's a long and rich history of mescaline.
Yeah,
and
I think it kind of changes our idea of the history of psychedelics, because we tend to think this is a story that started in the 1950s or when Hoffman sort of discovered LSD. But in fact, it turns out that mescaline, as a sort of pure chemical, has been around for well over 100 years. And then, of course, before that, there's peyote and guachuma.
Absolutely, yeah. And I guess this all starts with the Spanish encountering these plants and their colonization of the New World. And you noted that though the mescaline cacti had a variety of interpretations for its indigenous use, even with comparisons to the Christian Eucharist, all the way through to an utterly demonic mix of wonder, fear, and practicality. Could you expand on this and how the colonizers saw this practice?
Sure. I mean, obviously, the history of both cacti goes back thousands of years, but the first written records we have are from the Spanish when they arrived in Mexico as conquistadors and with Jesuits, to convert the population. So you have quite a lot of written records from around then, from like sort of the 16th century of peyote and how it was being used. And, they saw straight away that the local people who were taking peyote were having visions. And they'd come, all the Spanish obviously had come from Europe at the height of the witch craze. So for them, this was obviously the work of the devil. They projected all that stuff onto it. But they also had this, it was very strange for them to see because it looked so like their own religious practices in some ways. The priest or the shaman would wander around with the peyote buttons and give them to, each celebrant one at a time, and they'd kind of, bow their heads and mutter little prayers. They'd burn the copal incense, just like the Spanish burnt frankincense in their churches. So they had to, figure out, from their point of view, like what's going on here? Is this like the devil kind of parodying the sacrament, or is this kind of something that God's done to prepare the way for the Indians to be Christianized? So you get this, all these very strange interpretations around that point, but it all comes down in the end to, the fact that, whatever it is, it's got to be got rid of so that Christianity can replace it. So in 1620, the Inquisition in Mexico prohibited the use of peyote. They said, this is these visions it produced are from the devil. And, that's actually the first drug prohibition imposed by the modern West. The whole war on drugs, I guess, if you want to take it back, that's the beginning of it.
Yeah, deep roots indeed. And as you noted in the book, abandoning vision-giving plants proved one of the most stubborn doctrinal obstacles to the Indians' conversion, and even that they would baptize infants with guachuma. So this was clearly a long-standing practice that was not going to go away.
No, that's right. And you get this great stuff of Jesuits complaining, like, this is the really hard bit of trying to get them to give it up, because, of course, for the indigenous Mexicans, then Christianity was kind of magic as well. So it was like, why not have both? You know, let's call the peyote, you know, let's put it on the protection of the Virgin Mary or one of the saints, and let's use it in Christian ceremonies. So, you know, the real concern for the Spanish was not just that the indigenous people would continue to use it, but actually that kind of mestizos and Spanish and other people would kind of, you know, start to use peyote in just kind of household magic, you know, curses and charms and cures. So you could see the two kind of starting to merge in ways that were very uncomfortable for the church.
Right, and getting increasingly syncretic through the ages, I imagine. Right, so it still seems overall that Wachuma, or San Pedro as we know it, is a little underrepresented in the history of mescaline. Especially given its sort of more ease of accessibility these days, places outside the US, Mexico. Why is this?
I think it's really because, you know, if you think about the beginning of our sort of modern psychedelic movement in the 60s, at that point, people hadn't you really yet figured out what Wachuma was and how it was being used? Like Aldous Huxley, who I guess is our patron saint for today, you know, when he talks about the ancient use of Mexico, you know, when he's writing in the 50s, he talks about peyote and the Native American church, but he doesn't mention Wachuma. And that's because, you know, it was only just being established at that time that Wachuma actually contained mescaline. And it was also, you know, anthropologists and people were only just starting to figure out that it was still used in these curandero ceremonies, particularly on the Peruvian coast, because there were still laws against witchcraft in Peru at that time. It was all illegal and happened undercover. So really up until the 70s, nobody much outside the Andes knew about Wachuma. So just, you know, it's actually just incredible that in the last 50 years, you know, it's gone from that to being this kind of, you know, global, you know, sort of neo-shamanic movement that it's become today.
Yeah, especially given the sort of extremely rich culture of Chavin de Huantar, you know, an entire civilization with San Pedro at its core. Was that Douglas Chiron, the first anthropologist to really immerse himself in Wachuma culture? Was he the one that discovered the sort of connection with Chavin?
No, the connection with Chavin, again, that was also something that was only just emerging, you know, sort of in the 1950s and so on. It was a Peruvian archaeologist called Juan Teo who did the work up there. And until then, people thought, you know, that this Temple of Chavin, which is this spectacular site, you know, if we ever get to travel the world again, you know, I just recommend it to anybody. It's got these enormous, great temple walls studded with kind of heads, sculptured heads. And some of them are human and some of them are jaguar and some of them are something in between, with like a lot of them with like a lot of snot coming out of their noses. You know, it's it's incredible to walk into. And then when you get into the inner temple in the center, there's carvings around the edge. And one of them is one of these kind of human jaguar shape-shifting figures carrying a huge Wachuma. And it was only really, you know, until Teo came along, archaeologists had kind of assumed that this must have been like some outpost of the, you know, Mayan culture or something else, you know, because everybody thought that, you know, this ancient monumental stuff just started in Mexico and in Mesoamerica. And took a long while before people realized, oh, actually, this is kind of an indigenous culture of the Andes that we didn't know about. And it's older than people thought, you know, it's like, 2,000-3,000 years old. And there's the Wachuma right there. And then a lot of sites connected with it. There's also the snuff trays, these beautiful little carved bone trays with the Y-shaped snuffing stick that people used for Anadnanthra, Vilca, DMT snuffs. So, Wachuma is right there at the very beginning of this kind of pristine civilization in ways that people didn't really understand until recently.
And is it a myth that it was a mostly peaceful culture, that it sort of kept itself from invasion and that was sort of recognized as a sacred place and never invaded? Yeah,
I mean, the Chavin site looks like it was kind of a temple, a sort of mystery cult. There was not a lot of people living there. There's not a lot of habitation. There's no military fortification. So it looks like it was this place that people went to have a particular kind of, religious or ecstatic or shamanic experience. So in the cultures around that, other cultures were rising and falling, and even before the Incas, there were other warlike cultures like the Wari and in Bolivia, the sort of around Tiwanaku, where there's also a lot of Wachuma stuff. There were empires coming and going, but it looks like Chavin itself was, maybe like in Greece, you had the Eleusinian mysteries in the Temple of Eleusis. Of course, the Athenians and Spartans were fighting each other all around, but this was a kind of special, sacred destination.
Yeah. And one of the most amazing things I've read about it is the use of archaeoacoustics, the conch shells that have been found there to modulate sound while the person on San Pedro's journeying through this metaphorical underworld.
I mean, that's it's just fascinating to wander around it for that reason, because if it's a temple constructed for a particular type of religious experience, and that religious experience we know from the carvings and the artifacts involves probably a number of psychedelic plants. It's interesting to think about how that would have worked. There's like a big plaza in front, which is kind of where people have sort of group ceremonies, and then the temple behind it is kind of full of tunnels, twisting, turning tunnels, and in there, people have the streams have been rerouted, so you get all these kind of rushing water sounds, and people have found conch shells and bits of mica, kind of mirrors and things. So it looks like there was a kind of some kind of group ceremony that happened outside, and then this individual initiation, that happened in the core of the temple.
Absolutely, it does seem to have a lot to do with rites of passage and initiation, and hopefully we'll learn more about that as the archaeologists discover more. So peyote, the first reports of peyote come from James Mooney in the early 1890s. Could you tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, so the peyote, as the Spanish were the first records we have, but we have archaeological records from like the Texas-Mexico border as it is now, the Rio Grande, going back thousands of years, so it had been used there forever. By the 19th century, there was kind of a little bit of a sort of trade thing going on there. Different tribes would congregate, and Mexican tribes would meet with tribes like the Apache groups like the Lipan and the Mescalero, but most Native Americans, most Plains Indians, had never encountered peyote because it didn't grow up there. So it was only really after they were defeated and in forced captivity on the reservations, and the Texas Railroad was built. That was when you started to get peyote being brought up from one tribe to another, up to places like Oklahoma. And it seems like that's where, the Native American peyote ritual, the peyote religion started. And probably, sometime in the 1870s, 1880s. And the first white man to become part of it was, this guy, James Mooney, who was an ethnographer, worked for the Smithsonian Institution, and he was working on the cultures and the traditions of the Indian tribes, as they were called at that time. And, this was during the period of assimilation. So there was a federal US Bureau of Indian Affairs, and basically their thing was, there aren't going to be any Indians in the future. These are just going to be Americans like the rest of us. So the whole deal was take their kids away, put them in boarding schools, make them speak English. So James Mooney was really swimming against the tide when he was trying to capture and preserve these traditions. And then somebody in 1891 in Oklahoma came to him and said, we're having a special meeting of the mescal, as they called it, ceremony, and invited him. And then James Mooney joined them, and that's the first account that we have. And after that, he spent the rest of his career advocating for the peyote religion, insisting that it should be preserved against, a federal and state, US bureaucracy that was constantly trying to ban it and prohibit it and close it down.
It sounds It sounds quite analogous to the rise of the ayahuasca religions as a result of the rubber boom, bringing different practices from different Indian tribes together and realizing that they had this thing in common, and out of that arising a syncretic bridge between the native and the colonialist worlds.
Yeah. No, it's very much that. It was a kind of pan-Indian movement. It really got going in the wake after the ghost dance was suppressed. That had been like a big pan-Indian movement that brought the tribes together. So it was that. And the other thing was it was clandestine. It was secret, because by that time singing and dancing and things like sort of traditional ceremonies were all banned on the reservations. So that was why it happened in a teepee at night, that this was something that could happen undercover that the authorities didn't know about.
Right. Yeah. So again, like Wachuma, the Spanish obviously saw peyote as a debauchery, a type of drunkenness. Yet it's strange you mentioned that the Indians saw alcohol as a psychedelic. Yet this relationship changes over time, ironically leading to peyote being used to treat alcohol addiction. I found that very surprising.
Yeah. Well, I think this is one of the things that, when the Spanish first encountered peyote in Mexico, they talked about it as kind of borrachera, drunkenness. That was kind of how they saw it. And at the same time, the indigenous Mexicans, when they encountered alcohol, they took it on quite differently, in a much more spiritual kind of way. They never did what the Spanish did, which was, they having alcohol around, and you'd maybe have a glass or two on your own, or kind of just drink socially. It was kind of, for Indians, and people coming from the traditions of vision quests and so on, peyote they saw peyote more in that way, like they saw alcohol more in that way, like peyote or datura. So you get interesting stories from early on about how, when a group of Native Americans are given a bottle of spirits, they'll kind of nominate one person to drink it all. It's they have a whole different idea about what's going on. So the Spanish look at indigenous peyote ceremonies and think, oh, this is kind of a drunkenness. This is just sort of debauchery. And the indigenous Americans looked at alcohol and took it in a much more spiritual direction. But then, as you say, it became a real problem for the tribes in their forced captivity on the reservations. Obviously, when their lifestyle, their culture was taken away from them, and there was cheap alcohol around. That was a real problem. And one of the things when the Native American church got going, the peyote religion, a lot of it was about kind of, keeping your culture and keeping your spiritual core and, living, keeping alive the old medicine, the old way. And alcohol was seen as, very destructive to that. So the peyote religion, the Native American church, as it became, was always kind of a place for the people who weren't drinking their lives away. And if you were, then you'd expect the roadman in the teepee to give you a bit of a lecture about that. So it became, and also peyote was always thought to have special powers against sort of the white man and the white man's diseases. And alcoholism was seen as a white man's disease. So then the idea was, if you join the peyote religion, then it cures that disease and takes it away. So, it became kind of really the center of resistance against alcoholism among the tribes.
Okay, yeah. Because when you mentioned bringing the past and present, it reminded me of this incredible mythology tied into what you described around peyote is the deer maize peyote complex, which represents the past hunter-gatherer with the deer, the present agricultural society with the maize, and peyote being the bridge between the past and the present. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that comes out of Huichol culture. The Huichol are a tribe in the north of Mexico who, when the Spanish arrived there, they took themselves off to the very remote Sierra Madre, and they kept their culture very, much as it was before the Spanish arrived. and they make an annual pilgrimage to the place they used to live, Wirikuta, they call it, their sacred place where the peyote grows. And Barbara Meyerhoff, who was the first anthropologist to accompany the Huichol on a peyote hunt, and this was kind of, she noticed that, as they say, the deer and the maize and the peyote, these are our big symbols. They said to her, and you see them in all their art. And she was this was her idea, which I think is kind of is very beautiful. Is that the deer talks about the time when they were hunters, and the maize talks about the present now when they're kind of cultivators. They both do a bit of both. But the peyote is this kind of mercurial agent that joins the past and the present together. So when you're in the peyote's sacred country, or when you take the peyote, you go to this place outside time, this kind of eternal moment where the past and the present are together. And even though the past is kind of mythic and beautiful and lost, and the present is kind of a bit scuzzy, in sort of this westernized, sort of fucked up modern world, the peyote kind of brings you to this place where it's all one.
So we get to the point where it's brought back to Europe, which obviously takes on an entire life of its own, and it's introduced to philosophers like William James, who is so often quoted for his words on the alterations of consciousness. Yeah. And he seemed to have quite a sensitivity to it. And Havelock Ellis being another one who seemed to take it much more adventurously.
Yeah. This is like a really fascinating literature, I think, in the 1890s when peyote arrives. And of course, doctors and scientists are interested in it, and psychologists, because it has these extraordinary effects on the mind. And as soon as it arrives, Western researchers get very sort of fixated on the visions, because there's nothing else that produces these kind of visions. And the fact that you can take 3 or 4 buttons of peyote and lie down in a darkened room and close your eyes and see this like incredible movie show for hours, this is something that's really fascinating. And Havelock Ellis, who you mentioned, who was the first person to take it in London, he was a doctor, but he was also an art critic and an aesthete, and he wrote a fantastic description of this, very much from an aesthetic point of view, talking about the quality of the visions he's seeing, what it's reminding him of, in terms of modernist, impressionist art like Manet. He's like, this is the way that these people are now teaching us to see. But he's also looking back, and he talks about, that beautiful kind of Arabic tile work that you see in Cairo. He talks about the wooden carvings that you see on sort of Maori canoes. So it's kind of fascinating to have somebody from that era kind of on a strong dose of mescaline, just kind of interpreting it visually, for his time, and saying, talking about what it looks like to him. It really opens up so many new worlds.
Yeah, it's almost a perennial outlook there. And there's some really fascinating parallels with the discovery of mescaline in Europe and the advent of, cinema, X-ray, electric light, and these seem to almost be used as analogies to describe such a visionary experience.
Yeah, that's right. It arrives at just the same time in the West that electricity is really getting going, and that's the thing that so many of the sort of first Western people to take it reach for. It's like, because you're seeing kind of colors and sort of visual intensity of a kind that seems stepped up, from, sort of the normal level that you get in nature to this higher energetic level. My favorite is Havelock Ellis gives it to a bunch of people, including W.B. Yeats and another poet called Arthur Symonds, and this is in his apartment in London down by the Thames, and Symonds walks down there at the end of his trip and looks across the Thames, and there's one of the first kind of, flashing electric advertising signs, in London, and it's just going Bovril in kind of flashing red letters. And Arthur Symonds says he just looked at it for hours and he didn't think he'd ever seen anything so beautiful.
Wow. Oh, incredible timing, eh?
Yeah.
And so, obviously, we inevitably come to the isolation extraction of specific alkaloids from what we what was then called anhelodium peyote with Hefter, who we all know is standing out from the other researchers such as Savan, because he was prepared to take it himself. Whereas most assumed mescaline to be a dangerous and addictive drug.
Well, it was. Most of the early researchers took it themselves. Psychedelic science is, in the modern era is very, very conservative by comparison. Nobody ever takes these things themselves. We all have to look at brain scans. But back in the day, pretty much everybody, if you're interested in the subjective experience produced by these substances or plants, of course, there's only one way to go. Take them yourself. But the first chemist to really look at peyote and find out what was going on, Louis Levin, as you said, he'd started off his, he'd worked a lot with sort of early morphine addicts in the 1870s and 1880s. And he got a personal rule for himself of like, I never take these drugs because I've seen too many people, become addicted as a result. Arthur Hefter, who was a much less distinguished chemist, took, what was at the time the more obvious route, because as we know, there's a lot in the peyote. And so he started off by, you can separate out all the alkaloids, and then there's all these resins. And for a while, people thought that, the hallucinogenic compound must be in the resins. And, Levin was just giving all these different samples to dogs and trying to work out which one was hallucinating. Hefter at the same time went, okay, I'll take all the resins. Well, there's nothing in the resins. I'll take all the alkaloids. Yep. So now I'll split the alkaloids down. And he called them things like peyote and anhalanine. And then there was one that he called mescaline, because mescal was a word that was used for peyote a lot of the time. So he nailed mescaline down. Yeah, in 1897, that was the first what we'd regard now as a major psychedelic to be extracted from a plant.
Right, and there's a little bit of conflation there with the term mescal. There's mescal beans and there's the mescal tequila, and so it seems to be quite a common word for a number of different plants in the Americas.
Yeah, it was very. And of course there's the mescalero Apaches, and even like James Mooney was like, oh, they called that because they take the cactus or because they use the bean in their vision quests, and of course then there's the agave, spirit, the mezcal. So mezcal became a kind of word that meant local intoxicant. It was very vague and it confused people for a long time. But it carried on. And in fact, Aldous Huxley carries on using the word mezcal, to refer to peyote in the 70s. So it's never gone away. And I think, funnily enough, that kind of confusion persists even in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and Hunter S. Thompson talks about, fiendish cactus juice, and he's opening the trunk of his car and there's like loads of tequila in there and there's some mescaline, and it's kind of not clear sort of what's what. So I think, the word mezcal and mescaline still has this confusion like between sort of strong spirit and psychedelic, which is why, for obvious reasons, peyote makes much more sense, apart fact that peyote was the nahuatl, was the indigenous Mexican word.
Yeah. I guess that's happening with San Pedro now too.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, like we said about the way that in Mexico peyote was kind of put under the protection of the saints and things with Catholicism. The same thing happened with Huachuma. It was called San Pedro, because then it gave it a little bit of extra Christian magic on the one hand and a little bit of camouflage on the other. So I think we can go back to Huachuma now. That's good.
Yeah, that's nice. And so another interesting aspect of timing in the European world is the sort of development and application of physiological and psychological trials in the early 20th century. But it seemed to be that they really couldn't work out what to do with mescaline, mostly for its nauseating side effects, whether it was a stimulant, whether it was mood elevating.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it didn't. In 1919, it was first synthesized in the lab. Where Hefter had isolated it from the cactus in the Ernst Spate in University of Vienna, figured out a synthesis that starts with eucalyptus oil, actually, which is interesting. And And then, you know, after that point, you had this thing called mescaline that was like mescaline sulfate or hydrochloride that was a pure crystal salt. And that kind of has a different history, because once you've got it in that form, people were much less interested in the cactus and in the botany and in the culture that it came from. But then you had this thing that was kind of, as you say, you know, it was very long lasting. It was pretty much a physical ordeal. You know, people had the idea because it gave you, you know, it made your heart beat a bit faster. It might be a good cardiac tonic, and it was used a little bit for that. But it was also, it was a bit kind of bit hard to manage. And yeah, a lot of people had this nausea and found it quite difficult. What was really interesting was this fact that it produced what were then called hallucinations, because hallucinations were a very exotic mental phenomenon, you know, connected to schizophrenia and strange abnormal mental states. And normally if people were hallucinating, they weren't making a lot of sense, but people discovered that you could inject somebody with mescaline and then they would start sort of seeing these visual hallucinations. And there was also part of their mind that was quite rational. You could ask them questions and say, what are you seeing? And people would give you very detailed answers. So there was a kind of real interest, first of all, from psychologists in trying to understand what these visions were and what they might mean and where they came from. And then also among artists and philosophers, you know, trying to make sense of the experience. So yeah, back in the 1920s and 1930s, you know, decades before when we think of the psychedelic movement starting, there's this really fascinating world where, you know, psychologists are giving mescaline to people like, you know, Jean-Paul Sartre and, you know, sort of early modernist artists taking it and, you know, it sometimes in laboratory conditions or sometimes, you know, just in their studios kind of producing amazing psychedelic art back then.
Yeah, yeah. And it also ties in with Max Weber's notion of the disenchantment of the West, the discovery of this thing that brought about a sense of the numinous or a spiritual dimension to what was increasingly becoming a less sacred world through modernity and the tyranny of reason.
Yeah, no, that's right. So you do get from, you know, right from the beginning, as well as scientists and people being interested in that reason, in it for that reason, and also artists. You also get a lot of people who are interested in its, you know, using the sort of state of consciousness that it produces in spiritual ways. So probably the best known is Aleister Crowley, who, you know, and who worked with what he still called anhelonium, you know, just sort of in a slightly mysterious way. There was a American pharmaceutical company, Park Davis, who supplied a tincture, and Crowley used that. And then when he went to America, went straight to Detroit to the Park Davis factory and obviously charmed them because he got them to make a super strength version that he used quite a lot. And the other person I found around that time who was trying to incorporate into religious practice, which I didn't know about before, which is amazing, was Frederick Smith, who was the grandson of Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church. And Frederick Smith was the president of a group of the Latter-day Saints, you know, a Mormon church in Missouri. And he spent some time with Native Americans and participated in peyote ceremonies himself. And he had just this feeling that you're talking about, that the modern world was getting very mechanical and disenchanted. And, you know, what people needed out of religion was like a really full-on mystical, you know, sort of ecstatic experience. So he kind of wrote, you know, into the 1920s about how, you know, wouldn't it be great if the Mormon Church could adopt peyote as their sacrament? The Mormon Church then, you know, fell into schisms and struggles after that, and the idea got lost. But it's kind of so interesting to think that, you know, back in the day that, you know, that it was, you know, among this kind of ferment of emerging religions, you know, that, you know, there could have been that crossover from the Native American Church into something like Mormonism.
Yeah, and America's freedom of religious laws, I guess, written so tightly into their constitution. Yeah, a very different world it would be if they had incorporated peyote and remained that way. In the,
I guess they'd have been more like the Santo Daime in Brazil or something. Yeah.
True. Yeah, and another really fascinating story was the Fifth Avenue socialite Mabel Dodge, who held her own little ceremony in upstate New York. And And this is before Crowley. Tell us
Yeah,
about.
about the same time that Crowley's passing through New York, a year or two before. There's, as you say, this kind of bohemian socialite, Mabel Dodge, as she's called at that time, very wealthy, fascinated by sort of new age, new thought and spiritual ideas. And she's got a friend of a friend who's an anthropologist who's just come back from Oklahoma with some peyote buttons. So she's like, let's get a ceremony together in my apartment in Greenwich Village. And she invites a kind of random selection of her friends, poets, anarchists, whatever. And she writes a kind of very, very detailed description of this trip that turns into a complete nightmare, because as soon as the peyote kicks off, everybody is just, going in very, very different directions with it. Some people getting really absorbed and saying nothing, and other people trying to break the ceremony up and destroy it. And, and then Mabel Dodge's young cousin who's staying has a real major freak out and disappears. And it's this really chaotic trip that we've got this very full record of back there. So it's kind of fascinating to see that, just how strange that was, and how even like the most bohemian circles in New York were not ready for psychedelics at that point.
It sounds like it. And I guess what her story revealed too was how, because she moved away, didn't she? She moved down to the...
Yeah, that's the... when they... after that kind of spiritual quest then led her down to New Mexico, and she settled in Taos, and she eventually married a community leader of the Taos Indian Pueblo down there called Tony Lewin. She became Mabel Dodge Lewin. And there was a kind of socialist community lawyer she knew in New York called John Collier, who was sort of feeling a bit of heat after the Russian Revolution. He was on everybody's commie list, so he came down to Taos, and he started working with Native American Indian rights groups down there. And then in the 30s, with Roosevelt's New Deal, he was made Indian commissioner. So John Collier, as Indian commissioner, about the first thing he did was to say, we have no right to interfere with Indian religious practices. So after, 50 years of, the federal government trying to stamp out peyote and close down Indian religion, that was kind of what really turned it around, and opened up this space for the Native American church, to operate. So by this time, Mabel Dodge, who had never had a terrible peyote trip first time, she was like a real raving anti-peyotist at this point, but nevertheless, she managed to, it was only through her kind of strange, sort of bad trip in New York that John Collier ended up down in New Mexico, and that ended up turning the whole history of the Native American church around.
Yeah, because what it says, it revealed that it was mostly the nomadic Indians that adopted peyote more easily than the ones that were more sort of static and staying in one place.
Right, because like in the Taos Pueblo has been there for 1,000 years. It's beautiful, incredible sort of adobe sort of buildings rising up into the cliff, and it's a very, very structured society. And it's got the kiva, which is its sacred space in the middle, and pretty much everybody is involved one way or another in maintaining the kiva and the kiva ceremonies, and everybody's got their own role. So when something like peyote religion comes into that culture, it's quite disruptive. And it had come from the tribes in the West, like the Comanche and the Kiowa and the Apache, who were much more freewheeling. Like, the Comanche society was always very loose. It was basically war bands, and anybody could say, okay, I'm going to go over here and do raid, over here or over there, who's with me? And you could come and go. So, within a society like Comanches, it was much easier for small groups to start using peyote, and some people did and some people didn't, and that wasn't a problem. But yeah, in the sort of settled, Pueblo communities, it was much more, divisive and problematic.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And then with this move to structure peyote religion as a cult, for want of a better word, although that word was used a lot, and the sort of consequent need for umbrella protection under First Amendments, there there's already a precedent for Indian churches like the Native American church, which I found really interesting. Is the first time the term Indian is used. Is that right?
American, yeah. I didn't realize this either. This was like the president of the Native American Church of Oklahoma told me this, and it kind of blew my mind. I checked it out, but it seemed to be the case. Indians, as they were called then, didn't actually become American citizens until 1925. So, and the word Native American had been used, but it was used by kind of, white settlers, to distinguish themselves from, these kind of Irish or Indian immigrants, so they were kind of like, I guess, the original sort of Trump party called themselves Native Americans. So the Native American Church was formed by James Mooney, because who'd just been, speaking on behalf of peyote at a, House of Representatives hearing where they were trying to ban it. And he spoke to a group of leaders of the Oklahoma tribes, which is the Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and said, look, there's more of this coming down the pike. We've got to protect ourselves somehow. When there was a lawyer, a white lawyer in Oklahoma who was sympathetic, and he said, well, let's set up a charter. Let's call ourselves a church, because then we're protected under the First Amendment, freedom of religion. So they drew up this charter for their church and wrote in it that peyote was their sacrament. And that's basically the document that has kept the show on the road for the last 100 years. But then they decided to call the church the Native American Church, which was just a very bold thing at the time, because it's saying, white Puritans are not Native Americans. There's only one Native American people, and that's us. And we're Americans as well. Oh, and this is a church. So it's a super strong statement.
Yeah. I guess it's semantics to some people.
Yeah, semantics with a lot of legal force behind it.
Yeah. So, but Mooney's eventually dismissed by the Bureau, which sort of leads to a lot of his research going unpublished by the sound of it. And there's still remained sort of seizures of peyote and mass destructions of like 176,000 buttons, and so it seems to take a little while to really settle.
Yeah, there's a lot of current. I mean, again, it's at the end of Prohibition, alcohol prohibition, the Alcohol Bureau, it sort of lost a lot of its operatives, and that was the time when Harry Anslinger was running the Narcotics Bureau. So he started talking up the threat of narcotics, and then so a lot of the Alcohol Bureau operatives got rehired, and then they kind of built marijuana up into this terrible menace. As we know, this is reefer madness days, and they also had peyote in their sights at that point. This was something else that needed to be closed down. And the attempts to close down peyote among the Native American Church were intense for decades and decades, and are probably still not over. At state level, there's all kinds of policing as well as federal level. In the 1990s, it got to the Supreme Court. There was a judgment made that, that attempted to remove their, special freedom of worship, and they had this massive campaign again. So, it's just like, and it has become over the last 100 years more and more anomalous that, people of Native American ancestry are allowed to use what's now a Class A drug that nobody else is allowed to use. It's just become, with the passage of time, the stranger and stranger thing, and it's taken like, sort of real force to hold that space.
Yeah, because you mentioned that the isolation of the drug compounds sort of served to sever links to the indigenous peyote use in their culture. And I wanted to mention when you talked about the extraction from eucalypt oil, is actually one of our Australian researchers discovered that there's a 1964 study by the Australian Army looking into extraction of mescaline from eucalyptus sawdust. So yeah, there's definitely something to that, which I think requires a lot.
Yeah, well, that could well have been from sort of Spate's original synthesis.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and also as mescaline merges with the growing field of psychology, it moves it past the pure sort of physiological, measurable aspects of the mind and much more inward towards the subjective experience, and becomes really a unique tool for understanding different dimensions of the mind.
Yeah, that's right. And that's yeah, this exhibition you mentioned at the beginning, I discovered in my research that at the Maudsley Psychiatric Hospital in London, a couple of psychiatrists in the 1930s who were studying hallucinations kind of found, said, well, let's give mescaline to subjects and see if they can kind of draw their hallucinations for us so we can study them. And they tried to do this with kind of, people who were sort of suffering from psychotic episodes, and found out that, people couldn't really draw in that state or weren't really interested. So they thought, well, let's recruit some artists. And they thought, well, let's get some surrealist artists. Because they're interested in all this automatic writing and the products of the unconscious. So, yeah, I discovered there's this huge, great sort of stash of works by surrealist artists done under mescaline in 1936 that, nobody had ever looked at. So there's loads of fantastic, interesting work there. Where it really changes is when it's sort of in the 1950s, when it comes towards the sort of modern psychedelic story that we know, because that's when psychiatry gets a much more biological. People start getting more interested in looking for chemical cures for things, and particularly for schizophrenia. And people get the idea that mescaline and this other, mescaline-like substance called LSD that's just been isolated, that these seem to produce symptoms of, kind of delusion and time and space distortion and hallucinations. So maybe what they're doing is the same as what schizophrenia is doing. So maybe if we study them, we'll find the chemical cause of it. And then that's the time when you get, the first things like chlorpromazine, these things that kind of the antipsychotic drugs. And so people go, well, now we've got this drug that can make a psychosis start and switch it on, and then we've got another drug that can switch it off, so we can study it in the lab. So that's when people get less interested in the subjective experience in the 50s and more interested in, just, doing all the kind of, piss tests and sort of cell studies and all that kind of, looking for physiological markers.
Right. So I guess we should mention Barringer, because he had an interesting approach that there was a correlation with the visions and personality types.
Yeah.
That was obviously a trend in psychology at the time, but it seemed a little bit hard for him to really apply the categories he would have liked.
Yeah. Yeah. He's Kurt Beringer's really interesting. He was a neurologist at Heidelberg Psychiatric Clinic, and he ran probably the biggest trial in the 1920s of mescaline. He gave it to dozens and dozens of subjects by injection, sort of 200, 400, up to 600, milligrams, sort of big doses. Yeah. And then he'd kind of say to people, close your eyes. Okay, what are you seeing? And they'd say something like, well, I'm seeing all these silver circles spinning around clockwise. And now I look at them, they've got like spokes of a wheel, and there's this kind of blue light coming up behind them. And then now I can see these figures dancing on top of, and people would talk like that for hours and hours and hours. And his book has never been translated into English, but it's great. I mean, it's got hundreds of pages of appendix of just describing mescaline hallucinations, and he's trying to figure out, what's this telling us about the people and their personalities? Who sees what and why? These kind of questions that we're still interested in. But he found it very hard with mescaline, because everybody seemed to say this is like a kind of, this is just like this kind of animation or this kaleidoscope or these images that are just kind of coming at me out of nowhere. And it didn't seem that you could kind of say, oh, well, if you're seeing circles spiraling around this way, that means you're an anxious type or anything like that. So at the end, Beringer was very kind of honest about this. He said, look, I've given this to dozens of people. It's really fascinating. But as to, the connections between the visions that people have and the kind of people they have, it just doesn't seem to work on that level. It just comes from somewhere else.
Right. Yeah. Yet, when Maya Gross introduces mescaline from Germany to the UK, researchers like Kluver became fixated on this visual component, which led into the idea of form constants, which is still used quite a lot to describe.
Yeah, this is probably the bit of mescaline research from that era that is still with us. Heinrich Kluwer, he was in Chicago at the time. He looked at all Beringer's studies, and he took peyote himself, and he read all these descriptions of people's visual experiences, and he said, well, hang on, if you get back behind this, there's a few what he called form constants, things like, you know, the lattice and the web and the cobweb and the tunnel. So he mapped out these kind of basic shapes, and he said, you know, probably this is telling us something about what mescaline is doing in the brain. You know, it's disrupting the sort of, you know, sort of optical brain system in some way that's overlaying these patterns and grids. And at the same time, it's also making colors more intense. It's a bit like on a monitor screen, if you turn up the color and turn up the contrast. And that's why you kind of often see, if you see a bright red line, you'll often see a bright green line around it. You know, it's those kind of, so he began this kind of way of talking about the sort of psychedelic visual effects in that way, and looking at the way they work in the brain. And, you know, that's still with us. A lot of people still cite his work. I mean, probably the most, the one you might have come across recently is David Lewis Williams, who looks at a lot of cave art, and he's kind of uses Kluwer's form constants to say, look, you know, webs, you know, spirals, lattices, these people must have been in an altered state of consciousness when they produced this.
Exactly. I think he's one of Graham Hancock's most cited authors.
Yeah.
But even with this idea of form constants, he noted that they exist within, and I love this, a cosmic flux that never quite leads to revelation. It's that sort of peak of the wave, never quite crashing. And you can sort of see how that is applied across all psychedelics, as Hoffman compared mescaline immediately to LSD and vice versa.
Yeah, so right, that it's about the kind of continuous flux and the process. And I read Kluwer kind of gets that. And the other thing that Kluwer said, I mean, people remember all the form constant stuff, but he also says, at the end, yeah, we can do all this kind of structural analysis, but, you know, if you've actually had these experiences yourself, you know that it's kind of not just that. You're not just like, it's not just like looking down a kaleidoscope. You know, this is kind of an awesome experience. It's really, really powerful. And, you know, we're not capturing that. We're just capturing the bits that science can capture, you know, but you know, there's, you know, what this is really doing is kind of elusive. And as you say, you always think you're getting there. You think it's all going to kind of come together and coalesce and, you know, present itself in its perfect finished form, but it never does.
Or if it does, you can never explain it properly.
Yeah.
And so we get this critical text called Piotr from the French, which is with a real interest in the psychic potential of plants and shamanism, which kind of reveals the disjunction between the Indian approach of plants, psychoactive plants as panacea, illness as metaphysical, and the cultural context in which medicine is taken, something we in the postmodern West are sort of often struggling with, the context, and I guess how the healing is perceived and the results of that perception.
Yeah, that's right. And that's Alexandre Rouillet, who wrote, you know, this is another thing about mescaline, is that a lot of the great stuff isn't translated into English. His book, Le Peyote, from the 1920s, is fascinating because he grew a lot of peyote himself, and he made his own peyote medicine, his own extract. He believed that the entourage effect was important, that, you know, his peyote extract was superior to, you know, any mescaline that might come out of a lab. And he also had studied, you know, a lot the use of peyote in indigenous cultures. And Wachuma, I mean, he didn't know, obviously, at that time that it contained mescaline, but he writes about that as well. And he says something I think is very interesting about how can it be that in indigenous cultures, the peyote is a kind of panacea? It works for everything. And yet, you know, in our Western medical culture, it kind of does a few things that we can recognize, like it makes our heart beat faster or it makes our blood pressure drop, but it doesn't, you know, we can't really find a medical application for it. And he said, you know,
field.
Yeah, that's right. And as he, you know, he says it's because, you know, the whole idea of sickness is different in indigenous cultures. It's not kind of, got physical biomarkers. It's a spiritual experience. It might be that you're being cursed by somebody. It might be a symptom of something else that's wrong. So, whenever you look at traditional indigenous healing, then you also see that people are using these plants for divination. Had somebody put a curse on me? My sister went to the big city. How's she doing? Is she okay? I lost my wedding ring. Where is it? And, of course, Western medical people look at all this and go, oh, that's superstitious nonsense, and discard all that. But as Rouillet says, it's actually the same. The healing and the divination are all part of the same thing. And we can't, just like easily pluck out the sort of medical bits from indigenous cultures and plug them into our model.
Right. Yeah. And there's so many aspects of the experience that are beyond purely psychological or purely physiological or purely emotional. And again, another critical text that's in German is Mescaline Rausch that you mention a lot.
Yeah.
And it was interesting you noted the word means rush or rush of water. Could you elaborate on that, how that fits to the mescaline experience?
Yeah, this is Beringer's book, Der Mescaline Rausch. Rausch is a word that is used in German for, it's usually translated intoxication. So it's like being high, I guess. But instead of our metaphor of being high or expanded consciousness, it's about kind of rush and momentum and intensity, and it's something that you get in kind of sort of German literature around drugs and psychedelics. It's a concept that doesn't translate very well, but it's kind of, you get it highlighted in the mescaline literature, and people like the Walter Benjamin, the philosopher, who was injected with mescaline, and he kind of talks about Rausch a lot as this state that is kind of, and the problems of how you integrate that state with kind of, sort of normal, mundane consciousness and consensus reality.
Wow, yeah, and that's still an ongoing issue in the psychedelic community. And I guess mescaline, as the timeline progresses, becomes most well-known in popular culture through Huxley, Kesey, MK Ultra, Menlo Park. So where did mescaline fit into that whole sort of scene?
Well, it's mescaline is kind of where that sort of medical, chemical, biological sort of focus on psychedelics starts. And of course, because of Huxley's mescaline experience, it's the first psychedelic experience that gets really well known. But by pretty early on, by the end of the 1950s, it's kind of being replaced by LSD because for reasons that really boil down to the difference in dosage. Mescaline, you need about sort of 300 milligrams, so I guess a gram of mescaline is 3 or 4 doses. A gram of LSD, thousands of doses. So not only does LSD become kind of easier to produce as a pharmaceutical, but also for researchers, it seems more interesting. It seems it must be acting on this very specific trigger in the brain. And so that's the one that gets adopted, by research scientists. It's also the one that gets adopted by the CIA in their mind control experiments. They try pretty much everything, but that's the one that they end up. Yeah. And by sort of 1960, by the early 1960s, you can still get mescaline from sort of some labs if you've got the right letterhead or a PhD or whatever, but that's all kind of being closed down. And then what happens when the psychedelic scene starts in the sort of early mid 60s is, of course, all the underground chemists, it's the same calculation. Why make a gram of mescaline when you could make a gram of acid? So, people like Owsley go straight in with, I think Owsley, it was, he had some Sandoz acid that he got from Kesey, that Kesey had got from the labs in Menlo Park when he was an experimental subject there. and Owsley just kind of back engineered that. So as soon as the psychedelic culture got going, it was all about the LSD. But of course, mescaline, everybody remembered because of Huxley as much as anything else. So it remained this kind of legendary substance. Everybody had heard of it. It sounded very exotic. You know, some research chemists made like small batches for connoisseurs. But most of what was on the street being called mescaline by the late 60s was not mescaline. Quite often it was like a blotter or, you know, something that couldn't possibly contain a dose of mescaline, you know.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess one of the other sort of significant characters is Castaneda, not only responsible for popularizing peyote, but for setting up the Huichol Indians on a pedestal, I guess, as the most well-known and visible representatives of peyote guardians. Yeah, and yeah, talk about Castaneda because there's a lot to say there.
It's very interesting coming to Castaneda from this point, you know, when you've been through this whole kind of long history, and then you sort of pick up, you know, teachings of Don Juan again, which I hadn't done for a while, and you look at it, and the first thing you go is like, this is great, but how can anybody have thought that this was like kind of, you know, literally true? And his peyote experiences are just so completely different from anybody else's peyote experiences. You know, nobody kind of up to this point with peyote and mescaline, there are hundreds of descriptions. Nobody describes anything like kind of, you know, sort of rolling around with a dog and becoming a dog, and then like meeting this kind of sort of green cactus humanoid figure and looking through a hole in his hand and seeing the future. You know, so it's great kind of, you know, it's fantastic sort of psychedelic stuff, but it's kind of, it's definitely in its own space. But I think, you know, when it came along, it was, you know, a lot of the sort of rhetoric in the 60s from people like Tim Leary had been like, wow, this is this amazing moment. This is kind of like an evolutionary leap. No other generation has ever done this before. And, you know, Castaneda was, you know, has got a good message, I think, in the sense that, like, actually, yeah, a lot of people have been doing this for a very long time. We could pay a little bit more attention to the other cultures who've been working with this. And at the same time, you know, what he produces is a mixture of, you know, you can go, okay, this bit's from here, this bit's from there, this bit's from Michael Harner's work on the Hebrew, and this bit's from, you know, and a lot is from Barbara Meyerhoff and Peter Furst writing about Huichol, you know, and they were at UCLA when Castaneda was doing his you know, his PhD there, and Ramon Silva, the Huichol shaman, who they wrote about a lot. You know, it's, you know, there seems to be quite a bit of him in Don Juan, but I think, you know, I sort of came to see this as quite a, you know, as quite a positive strategy in a way, because this was a whole generation of people who were getting to know psychedelics for the first time, who were looking for cultural references, and it was kind of good that they got this cultural reference that was, in a way, a phony cultural reference, because, you know, the Yaqui people don't use peyote in their shamanism, and Castaneda kind of admits that. He says, well, of course, Don Juan had been around Mexico and he'd encountered lots of different cultures. He kind of tells us that this is like a grab bag of different people, but different cultures and, you know, different shamanic traditions. But it meant that everybody had kind of a model for this that wasn't treading on anybody's toes. You know, it wasn't like trying to appropriate Native American culture. It wasn't trying to appropriate Huichol culture. It was kind of a benign sort of fantasy culture that people could, you know, choose their own adventure with.
Which almost made it sort of more socially transportable and popular in contemporary culture, because it wasn't entirely academic. You know, anyone could pick it up with an interest in those things and get a great deal from it. And for many of us, it's our first point of reference.
Yeah, that's right. You know, and after the first couple of books, of course, he pretty much ditches the psychedelics, because he also had an eye on the New Age market. He was doing very well in that. He could see that, you know, that acid stuff was a bit 60s, and people had moved on from that into meditation and dance. And so he kind of took it in different directions after that.
Right. So I guess we can't talk about mescaline without talking about Shogun. So he had his first mescaline trip in April of 1960. With only 2 phenethylamines known about at that stage, being MDA and TMA. which leads them to create MDMA, which is structurally quite analogous to mescaline.
Yep.
So I guess we could say that mescaline is nature's MDMA, but Shulgin's a very, very critical player in all of this.
Yeah, I think he is, because his mescaline trip was his first trip, and as he said at the time, that unquestionably set his direction for the rest of his life. And then he produced these kind of, dozens and dozens of phenethylamines, obviously MDMA, 2CB, 2CT, all those kind of series. And I think that's one of the reasons that mescaline maintains such a presence in psychedelic culture today without kind of actually being available in itself, is that a lot of these compounds, particularly things like 2CB at the kind of trippier end, they're kind of, you can see them in a way as kind of sort of mescaline light. They're more manageable, they're less challenging, they only last 3 or 4 hours instead of sort of 12. The physical body load is kind of, it's still there, but often it's much more pleasant. It's got that euphoria that, that you find in the cactus as well. So I think it's kind of, it's kind of, in a way, what Shulgin did was design mescaline out of psychedelic culture by producing these other things that didn't have this kind of, sort of long duration and weird spectrum of effects that produced something that was kind of more like, a particular slice of that spectrum that was more user-friendly.
I think you add a very, very, very small dose too.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I guess having this emergence of synthetic mescaline analogs, where does that place peyote and the preservation of the plants themselves? Because we hear so much about peyote conservation and the plants under threat, and I understand there's a campaign going at the moment you spoke about earlier.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, peyote is under a lot of pressure because the demand is increasing. The Native American church itself is larger than it's ever been before. And as well as that, there's all kinds of people interested in peyote as a psychedelic. South of the border in Mexico, it's become a kind of thing that people put in sort of patent medicines and herbal medicines. You'll often find like bottles of stuff on a market stall with a picture of peyote or a huichol shamanon saying, peyote extract, who knows how much peyote. But in any case, supply is dwindling, particularly, the little bits of the United States in Texas where it grows. And and demand is increasing. Yeah, as I mentioned, maybe you can post a link somewhere. The Cactus Conservation Institute, which is a professor a botanist at Texas University called Martin Terry, working together with Keeper Trout, who you may know from his writings about the cacti. They are just buying a bit of command land in Oklahoma with a license to cultivate peyote. So this would really be a game changer for peyote conservation. And if you put the link somewhere, I'd really, it's well worth everybody's support. But in the meantime, the contrast with Wachuma is enormous, because Wachuma kind of grows everywhere, really, from Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, down to Argentina. And, I've been up and down some of those bits of the Andes, and it's kind of, there is no shortage of Wachuma. And there are so many different kind of strains it subspeciates in these different Andean valleys. So each one you come into, the Wachuma looks a bit different, and who knows, there could well have been human intervention in this over hundreds or thousands of years for higher mescaline content, shorter spines. And I'll just show you this. I was given this in the Alexander Shulgin Ranch in California last year. This is a cultivar produced by Keeper Trout and his compadres, which is apparently, much more potent than anything you'll find in the wild in the Andes. So, the sort of co-evolution between Wachuma and humans is kind of, I think, probably quite ancient and long established, and it's and it's definitely still moving. So I think definitely, unless you have some sort of special form of access, I would say that if you're looking for a cactus, the ethical choice is Wachuma. Not only because there's no shortage of supply there, there's no you can grow it yourself. It's easy, it's fast growing, and as because of the way that it hybridizes, I think all kinds of new strains of Wachuma are still emerging.
Absolutely. And much respect to Keep Trout for establishing the basic taxonomy, which just keeps ever expanding.
Amazing work there, and he's also working there now on Shulgin's archive, which is an enormous project, as you can imagine. So he's done amazing work, putting a lot of stuff out into the public domain, and stay tuned. There's loads more coming.
Absolutely. So we'll put the link to that campaign up under this talk, and I encourage everybody to check out Mike J's new book, Mescaline, A Global History of the First Psychedelic. It's absolutely, truly phenomenal, and really the only one of its kind. So well done for that.
Oh, thanks so much, Jef. Real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Mike.